Hey everybody, it's Courtney. I am one of the guest designers for Club La La Land this month. So I'm stopping by to show you basically what's in the kit as well as two projects that I've created with the kit. So we'll start with the dies here, and there's three separate dies, or three sets of dies, I should say. The first one is a little cupcake or a muffin, and these are two separate pieces, so you can kind of flip that over and make it a cupcake or a muffin. The second is this little mixer here, and again, these are two separate pieces as well, so you can put that bowl right under the mixer or use that separately, or use the mixer itself separately as well. The third is the Build-A-Cake die, and this looks a little crazy now, but these are two tiers of a cake. You have little strawberries that you can put on top, and these little frosting borders, I guess you could say. Next is the stamp sets. So as always, these are red rubber and they are all together. So you can either leave these as a whole and fussy cut your images out, or I usually cut them apart. You'll just want to make sure that you're using very sharp scissors so you don't tear the rubber. So we have Love to Bake Marcy here with 2 sentiments, and then we have the baking hamsters, which are so adorable, along with sentiments to go with those as well. I'm just going to share with you the first card that I made. I used Marcy, colored her with my Copic markers, as well as the cake, and I used 2 layers of those little frosting borders. I used the funky square stencil in the background, and I used the scalloped rectangle die as my border. So we'll jump right into the next project, and I'm going to make a few tags, and I'm going to be using some background stamps here also by La La Land. And I love to bake, and I love to give baked goods to friends and family, so it's always nice to put a little tag on the bag or the box. So I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White here, and I'm going to stamp my backgrounds with, this is cotton candy ink, and this is like a plaid background, and I'm going to be cutting this out anyway, so I don't have to have a perfect impression, but I am using my Misty just in case. For the next one, I'm going to be using the wood grain background here, and I'm going to be using Khaki ink by Simon Says Stamp, and I did have to stamp this one twice just because I didn't get a great impression. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it definitely had to be better than my first time stamping this. So these inks will kind of fade back, so it looks a little bit dark at first, but it will kind of fade back a little bit. I wanted this just to be a subtle background. So once that was done, I'm going to take another piece of Nina Solar White, and I'm just going to leave that as is. I'm not going to create a background at all for that one. And I am using the large stitched tag dies by La La Land, and I'm using the second to smallest one, and I'm going to cut out all 3 of my tags, and I keep bumping into my camera, so I apologize for that. So here is my tags. My plain one, I'm going to be creating a 1-layer tag, and then the other 2, I'm going to be popping up my images, and I'm going to be using my hamsters here. So for my 1-layer tag here, I'm going to stamp out my little hamster sitting next to that piece of cake, and then put that aside. Going to take another piece of Nina Solar White and stamp out that same hamster, but I'm not going to be using the cake. So you'll see what we'll do with that in a minute. And then I'll stamp this other little hamster holding this cupcake. We'll move right on to the Copic coloring. We're going to start with this 1-layer here, and I'm going to, like always, start off with my lightest color to get my darkest areas mapped out. Now for his little cheeks, they're obviously all puffed out because he's probably got cheeks full of cake. So I want these to appear round. So my shadows are going to be around his little puffy cheeks, a little bit on either side of his face, and where he's kind of laying behind the piece of cake. Going in with my darkest color, and for his little cheeks, I'm going around his cheeks and kind of extending out those little circles, but not all the way. I'm kind of making C marks, but I'm leaving just a little bit of a border on the side of his face or on the outside of his little cheeks, just so that I don't have two dark areas directly next to one another. I'll go in with my darkest midtone and extend all of those areas out, creating a little bit of a shadow on either side of his face and closing in those C's that we created for his cheeks a little bit more. Not all the way, again, just a little bit more, closing those in and extending those out a little bit. Next, going in with my lightest midtone and basically doing the same thing, extending those shadows on either side of his face. And for those little circles, I'm now going to close those little C's and extend those out towards the middle of his little cheeks. Same thing with his body, just extending those shadow areas. And then finally going in or back in with my lightest color to kind of blend all of those areas out. And this will make his little cheeks appear as if they are puffy or filled with cake. So for the little spoon here, I am going to be using some C markers. And at first I created a shadow on just the right side of the spoon. Again, leaving just a small white border on the edge. And I'm just using 3 different colors here. And it ended up blending in a little bit too much, and it didn't give that round appearance that I was looking for. So I ended up creating one of those little shadow lines or accent lines, whatever you want to call it, on the other side as well, and just quickly blended that out. And I liked the way that looked a little bit better. It made it look like the spoon was a little bit more round. For the cake itself, I'm going to be using my R80 markers. I also filled in his little nose there. Going to start off with the cake part itself, filling in the entire area with my lightest color. Going in with the darkest color, and I'm just going to be creating some dots off to the right-hand side. The further they are off to the right, the closer the dots will be, and then I'll extend those out a little bit towards the left and kind of space them out a little bit more. Same thing with the R85, just extended those out to the left-hand side a little bit further. Same with the R83, and I just wasn't liking the way this was looking, so I did go back and add some more dots and extended those out towards the left-hand side a little bit further than I did the first time around. And then I'll finish off with the lightest color and create dots across the entire thing and get those dots kind of blended out. And this will give some texture to the cake. I use the same colors or color combination for the frosting as well. I didn't really have any reasoning for my shading on this one. I just created some shading off to the right-hand side just because it looks like that part of the cake is further back. And I'm using the same color combination as far as the R80 markers for all 3 of my tags. So they're all going to have kind of the same color scheme, I guess. So extending that out with my darkest midtone, then the lightest midtone, and just leaving a little bit of a highlight towards the left-hand side of my frosting. And for the plate that the cake is sitting on, I wanted this to appear white. So I'm going to be using some C markers. First, I did take my colorless blender and fill in or get rid of all of my mistakes because I seem to be making a lot of those today. So for my shading for the plate, I'm going to create a shadow directly underneath the cake itself and a little bit towards or from behind where the cake is, where the plate would be rounded, I guess. So I'm just putting a few little flick lines with my darkest color. I don't want to use this too much because, again, I want this to appear white. Blending that out with my C3 a little bit, and then finally going in with the C1. And I am leaving some white space here, being I do want my plate to appear white. And finally, I'll take my colorless blender and quickly go over those white areas to get rid of those flick lines that you can still kind of see from that C1. I took some warm gray markers just to create a shadow underneath my little hamster and underneath my plate, starting with the W5, extending those shadows out a little bit with the W3, and then finally extending them out even further with the W1. Not really too concerned about having my shadows perfect. Shadows don't necessarily need to be perfect as long as you're grounding your images. So next I will go ahead and move on to the coloring of my other two hamsters here. Now for this one sitting next to the cake, I'm not going to color the cake this time. I'm just going to be coloring the hamster and the spoon, and I'm not even coloring the bottom portion of my little hamster. I am going to speed this up by quite a bit here because I'm using the same color combination and I'm coloring him the same exact way as far as his little puffy cheeks go. I'm going to be creating a shadow underneath his little face and arm, but you'll notice that I'm totally skipping the bottom portion of his body because I'm going to cut that out. What my plan is that I'm going to have him kind of popping out of the little bowl from the mixer die. I'm just going to use the bowl and he's going to be popping out of that bowl. So I don't need to color the entire thing. But colored the spoon the same way, this time learning my lesson as far as where I needed to put my shading on both sides of the spoon. And I definitely liked the way this one came out a little bit better. So for this next hamster here, I am going to speed this up a little bit more than normal, but a little bit slower than the last time here because I am using a different color combination. However, I am going to be coloring his cheeks basically the same way. I'm just mapping out my darkest areas at this point. And for his face, it's going to be pretty much the same as the first hamster. Still doing the cheeks the same way and creating a shadow underneath his little arms and underneath the cupcakes he's holding. And the E15 just was not dark enough, especially for his little cheeks. So I brought in the E18 just to get a little bit more contrast. If I just stuck to the E15 being my darkest color, I just wasn't going to be able to get the contrast I was looking for. Always remember when you're coloring, if you're not getting the contrast you're looking for, go with a darker color. If it's scary to use that color, if you think that it's too dark, just try it. You'll even if you just use a teeny tiny bit of it, you'll get that contrast you're looking for, and you'll notice a big difference with your coloring. So I'm going down, I filled that in with my darkest mid-tone, my lightest mid-tone. Now I'm on my lightest color, just filling in the rest of the areas, blending all of those areas out with those puffy little cheeks. And for the frosting on his little cupcake there, I am again using that same color combination for those R80 markers, and I'm just doing some shading on the bottom portion of the frosting and a little bit on either side, just concentrating my highlight being right there on the top because that would be obviously the lightest part. Also filled in his little nose with that R83 I think I used. For the cupcake wrapper, I'm just going to be using the C3 and the C1 just to create a little bit of shading underneath the frosting and on either side, but I did want this to appear white. So again, I'm going to go ahead and cut out my little bowl here, and I'm just working on a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to do my shading on either side of the bowl because this is a round object. I want my highlight to be right there in the center. Now this looks a little bit crazy because I am working on a scrap piece of paper, so you can't really tell where my coloring is starting on the die itself. But as I move it around, you'll kind of see I am using flicking motions just to make my blending a little bit easier. You don't necessarily have to do this. You could probably just use straight lines or go along the border of the bowl and get the same kind of look. Just making sure that I leave that center for my highlight, and this will make the image appear to be round. I also fussy cut out my little hamsters there, and you can see that I cut the bottom portion of that one little hamster out, and I'm just kind of placing him in that bowl to make sure that he fits, figuring out which tag I want to use for which image. And I ultimately decided to bring out the heart wreath die, and I cut out the smallest one, and I'm just going to smush my ink pad directly onto that, and you can see my ink pad is really drying out, and this oh my gosh, I can't even tell you how long I've had this ink pad. So it doesn't really necessarily look as pink as it does kind of like a yellowish or kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but it definitely doesn't look pink anymore. But just to make sure that that matched my background, I went ahead and colored that. I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my little hamster to the inside of the bowl. And then I'll use my Scotch foam tape to pop up my little hamsters. I did lay my little heart wreath flat onto my tag as well. And like I said, pop up my little hamsters directly over that little wreath. Next, we'll move on to the sentiments. And for my one layer, of course, I wanted to keep this one layer. So I'm bringing out my Hollyhock ink. And this is a close match to the R80 markers. And I'm just going to go ahead and stamp that directly onto my tag. Now, being I cut all of my stamps apart, you want to make sure, especially with your sentiments, that you pretty much cut straight at least along the bottom of the sentiment, and that way you'll be able to make sure that you're stamping straight directly onto your card. For this little top of the tag, I'm not sure what you call this, but again, I'm smushing my ink pad directly onto that to make sure that it matches my sentiment and my little cake there. And this kind of just wraps around the top portion of the tag. Just line up the little holes for your ribbon or whatever you twine, whatever you decide to use. And I just stuck that down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue and kind of just folded that over the top of my tag. And this just gives it a little bit something extra and a little bit more stability too. So for my next tag here, I am going to use one of the R80 markers to color in some of this cardstock here, just to make sure that I have my cardstock or my sentiment strip match the rest of the images that I colored. Treating that with my anti-static tool, and then I will go ahead and stamp out my sentiment with my Versamark ink, sprinkle on some white embossing powder and heat set that. And even though I thought that I cut my stamp straight, or I probably just stamped crooked, I went to trim this down with my paper trimmer here and realized that it was not straight. And it was such a teeny tiny piece at this point that it was going to be too hard to use my paper trimmer. So I got a little bit of courage and decided to try to straighten out my little sentiment strip with my scissors. And now typically, if you've ever watched my channel before, you know that I cannot cut a straight line, but it ended up working out pretty well, and it ended up at least appearing to be even. It's probably not, but it at least appears that way. So I will take another piece of Scotch foam tape and pop that directly up over my little hamster there. For whatever reason, I had such a hard time lining this up. I was able to cut the straight line, but I wasn't able to line up my sentiment. But once I was able to finally line that up, we'll move on to the final sentiment for the final tag here. And I am going to use that same Hollyhock ink and stamp that directly onto my card, or my tag, I should say. And I kept this flat against the tag as well. I used one of those toppers on this wood grain one and lined that up the same way. This one I didn't fold over perfectly, but it's okay if it's popped up a little bit. Like I said, this is just to give it some decoration and a little bit more stability for when you put your ribbon through. But that is it for today, guys. Here are the 3 tags, and be sure to check out Club La La Land. I'll leave all of the information below. Thanks for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.